The room was quiet in the way old rooms often are, not empty of sound but heavy with it, as if every creak and breath had already happened and was now waiting to be remembered. A single oil lamp burned on a side table, its flame unsteady, casting long shadows that climbed the walls and settled into the corners. Dust hung in the air, visible only when the light caught it just right, drifting slowly as if it had nowhere else to go. Outside, late autumn pressed against the windows, gray and damp, the kind of season that made even well-kept houses feel tired. This was the moment before the photograph, the pause before something permanent was created, when no one yet understood that the room itself was about to be asked to keep a secret. The parlor smelled of old wood and lamp oil, of fabric that had absorbed years of quiet conversations and unspoken rules. Two high-backed chairs stood side by side in the center of the room, placed there with careful intention. On them sat two cousins, positioned close enough to appear united, yet far enough apart to suggest an invisible line neither was meant to cross. Their backs were straight, their hands folded neatly in their laps, fingers still, as though they had been instructed not only to sit but to disappear into the pose. They did not look at each other. They looked forward past the camera, past the man adjusting his equipment, into something distant and unreachable. Behind them hung a heavy velvet curtain, dark and thick, drawn across the wall to serve as a proper backdrop. It was meant to soften the light, to add elegance to the image, but instead it swallowed brightness whole. The fabric drank in the lamp's glow, leaving the edges of the room in shadow. It was the kind of curtain chosen by someone who understood appearances, someone who believed that what was hidden mattered just as much as what was shown. The photographer moved carefully, his boots making only the faintest sound on the wooden floor. He was a professional, or close enough to one for the town to trust him with its likenesses. His name was never written down, not in ledgers, not on the back of the photograph, not in any surviving record. He adjusted the lens with practiced hands, wiped a spot from the glass, and leaned back to judge the composition. To him, this was another job, another family, another moment to be frozen and handed over. He could not know that the image would outlive his own name. The elder cousin sat on the left, dressed in a dark wool coat that seemed too heavy for the room, its weight visible in the way it pulled at his shoulders. The buttons were polished but worn, dulled by years of use. His collar was stiff, his posture confident, his gaze steady. There was an ease in the way he occupied the space, as though the room belonged to him, as though he had always been taught that it did. He did not fidget. He did not glance away. His stillness felt practiced, inherited. The younger cousin sat beside him in a lighter dress, pale in color, the fabric thinner, more delicate. At her throat, a small metal brooch shaped like a flower held her collar closed. It was one of the few personal items she owned, given to her years earlier when she first arrived at the house. Her hands were folded tightly, knuckles faintly pale, her shoulders drawn in just enough to suggest restraint. She was composed, but there was tension in the way she held herself, a carefulness that came from long habit rather than instruction. They were family, at least on paper. Cousins by blood, linked by a shared name and shared ancestry, but blood did not mean balance. It did not mean safety. Within the walls of that house, position mattered more than kinship. One belonged naturally. The other had been allowed to stay. The house itself belonged to the elder cousin's father, a man whose name carried weight in the town. He was a local magistrate, respected for his orderliness, his sense of duty, his devotion to proper conduct. His reputation rested on ledgers filled with neat handwriting, on sermons delivered with calm authority, on a public life that appeared clean and unquestioned. People trusted him because he was quiet, because he was measured, because nothing scandalous ever seemed to touch him. Silence in his world was proof of virtue. The younger cousin had arrived years earlier, after the deaths of her parents left her with nowhere else to go. She came with a small trunk and a few carefully folded dresses, her grief packed away because there was no room for it. She was taken in without ceremony, absorbed into the household like an obligation that did not need to be discussed. In public, she was spoken of kindly, referred to as the poor girl with sympathetic nods. In private, she was rarely addressed at all. She learned quickly where she belonged. She learned which rooms were hers to enter and which were not. She learned to move quietly, to listen more than she spoke, to accept gratitude as a substitute for choice. The house did not mistreat her in obvious ways. It did not need to. Its rules were unspoken but firm, enforced by glances, by pauses in conversation, by doors that closed softly but decisively. The photographer finished his preparations and stepped back. He raised his hand slightly, a signal that the moment was coming. "Still," he said, his voice low and practiced. It was a simple word used countless times, meant to ensure clarity and focus. Both cousins obeyed without hesitation. Their bodies settled into the pose, breath held just long enough. In that suspended moment before the shutter snapped, the room seemed to hold its breath as well. The lamp flickered. The curtain absorbed the light, and something else stood present, not as a body meant to be seen, but as a weight, a pressure, a knowledge that lingered just beyond the edge of sight. It was not an intruder. It was not a ghost. It was the quiet accumulation of things never said, of boundaries crossed and then politely ignored. The camera captured the image with a soft, mechanical sound, brief and final. The cousins did not move right away. The photographer lowered his hand and nodded, satisfied. Another likeness preserved. Another moment completed. The room exhaled, though no one noticed. The photograph would be developed, mounted, and stored like so many others. At first glance, it would appear ordinary, even respectable. Two young relatives, well-dressed, properly posed, framed by a tasteful backdrop. It would likely have been shown to visitors, tucked into albums, used as evidence of family unity and good standing. No one would have pointed to it and said something was wrong. There was nothing obvious to accuse, and yet something had been captured that day beyond faces and fabric. The tension in the younger cousin's hands, the ease in the elder cousin's posture. The way the light fell unevenly, as though reluctant to illuminate the entire scene. The photograph preserved not just what was visible, but what was felt. It sealed a moment shaped by imbalance, by silence, by an understanding that one person's comfort depended on another's restraint. Years passed. The house aged. The magistrate's name continued to be spoken with respect. The elder cousin grew into his place in the world, carrying his confidence with him like a well-fitted coat. The younger cousin faded from public mention, her presence noted only when necessary, her absence rarely questioned. Life moved forward as it always does, leaving small moments behind like discarded objects. The photograph, too, was left behind. It survived moves, cleanings, changes in fashion. It was folded into a ledger pressed between pages meant for accounts and records and forgotten. Dust settled on its edges. The paper yellowed slightly. Time did what it always does, softening details while sharpening meaning. When it resurfaced decades later, handled by someone with no connection to the family, no loyalty to its name, the reaction was immediate and unspoken. People looked at it and felt something they could not easily explain. A discomfort, a sense of imbalance, as though the room itself were leaning in, asking to be understood. They could not point to a single flaw. The photograph was technically sound. The subjects were clear. And yet the image seemed to know more than it showed. It carried the feeling of a held breath that had never been released, of a story paused at the moment before it could be told. The room, preserved in silver and shadow, had kept what it was never meant to keep. And in doing so, it waited patiently for someone, someday, to notice that stillness is not the same as peace, and that some moments, once frozen, refuse to stay silent forever. In that house, hierarchy did not need to be explained because it was visible in every object and movement, fixed as firmly as the heavy tables that never changed position and the portraits that watched from the walls. The magistrate's authority followed him even when he was not present, lingering in the quiet order of rooms, in the way doors were closed gently rather than slammed, in the careful tone people used when his name was spoken. Outside the house, his words settled disputes and shaped lives. Inside, it pressed down with greater force, shaping habits, expectations, and silences. The elder cousin grew up breathing this authority like air. It surrounded him so completely that he never thought to question it. Power was not something he sought. It was something he assumed, something that felt as natural as standing tall or speaking first. He moved through the house without hesitation, his footsteps unremarkable because they were expected. Chairs were pulled back for him. Conversations paused when he entered. Servants shifted aside instinctively, not out of fear exactly, but out of long practice. Even the walls seemed to make room for him. The younger cousin learned a different lesson. From the moment she arrived, she understood that space was something to be earned, not claimed. She learned to keep her voice soft, her presence light, her needs invisible. Gratitude was expected of her at all times, whether or not kindness had been shown. It was an unspoken debt that could never be fully repaid. She slept in a narrow room near the back stairwell, a place chosen for convenience rather than comfort, where the walls were thinner and the sounds of the house traveled easily. From there, she heard conversations not meant for her, low voices drifting through the floorboards, laughter that stopped abruptly when footsteps approached. Old houses carry sound the way they carry memory, and this one was full of both. At night, whispers moved through the corridors, soft and careful, followed sometimes by footsteps that lingered longer than they should have. No one ever spoke of these things in daylight. No accusation was written down. No complaint ever left the grounds. The house was known for its respectability, and respectability required discretion. But servants notice what others ignore. They noticed doors that closed later than usual, lamps that were extinguished earlier. The way the younger cousin's gaze dropped to her plate during meals, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her shoulders drawn inward as if she were trying to occupy less space than her body required. They noticed how she flinched at sudden sounds, how she lingered at thresholds as though unsure she was allowed to enter. Silence became a language everyone spoke fluently. It smoothed over discomfort. It turned unease into routine. The photograph was taken during a period when the house felt suspended between past and future, calm on the surface but unsettled beneath. The magistrate was proud of records, of documentation, of the written word, but only when it served order. Ledgers were kept meticulously, accounts balanced, names entered and crossed out with care. But there were no records for what happened after dark, no margins wide enough to contain the private arrangements of power. Family matters, he insisted, stayed within the family. Reputation was treated as a public service, something that benefited everyone if it remained intact. To question it was seen as selfish, even dangerous. After the photograph was taken, something shifted. The younger cousin grew quieter still, if that was possible. She stopped sitting by the window in the afternoons, where light once fell across her face and made her seem briefly at ease. She spent more time in her small room, emerging only when required. When spoken to, she answered politely but briefly, as though afraid of saying too much. The elder cousin, meanwhile, seemed to expand. He laughed more loudly. He interrupted without apology. His confidence sharpened, fed by the certainty that nothing he did would ever be questioned. Power, once left unchallenged, does not pause to examine itself. It grows accustomed to its own reflection. The injustice that lived in that house was not a single moment that could be isolated and condemned. It was a system, built slowly and maintained carefully, reinforced by custom, status, and the shared decision to look away. It survived because everyone benefited from it in some small way, or at least believed they did. Silence was praised as maturity. Endurance was mistaken for strength. Obedience was dressed up as virtue. And so the days passed, one indistinguishable from the next, each reinforcing the rules that governed the house. Objects absorbed this quiet tension without complaint. The banister bore the marks of hands gripping too tightly. The floorboards learned which steps were heavy and which were cautious. Even the furniture seemed to remember who was allowed to relax and who was not. Time moved forward, but it did not erase what had been imprinted. It only layered new routines over old wounds. The younger cousin carried herself like someone careful not to disturb the air around her, as though even her breathing needed permission. When visitors came, she smiled politely and kept to the edges of rooms, introduced with kind words that masked her true position. She was present but not quite included, acknowledged but not consulted. The elder cousin watched this with detached familiarity, never questioning why the balance felt so natural to him. The magistrate, for his part, saw only order. He believed the house ran smoothly because he had designed it that way. Any discomfort was, in his mind, a necessary byproduct of discipline. He did not ask questions that might complicate the story he told himself. Years later, those who would study the remnants of that household would struggle to find proof of wrongdoing. There were no letters spelling out accusations, no formal complaints, no dramatic confrontations recorded in ink. What remained were patterns, impressions, small irregularities that did not fit neatly into official narratives. A servant's recollection, vague but persistent. A change in behavior noted too late. A photograph taken during a moment of uneasy calm, capturing faces but not circumstances. Silence had done its job well. It had erased the sharp edges of memory, leaving behind only a dull ache that was easy to ignore. But silence leaves traces, even when it pretends not to. It settles into objects, into habits, into the spaces between words. And time, patient and indifferent, has a way of teaching those objects to speak. Long after the people who enforced that hierarchy were gone, the house would still seem heavy to those who entered it. Long after the rules were forgotten, their effects lingered in subtle ways, in the feeling that something had once been wrong and had never been set right. The injustice had been quiet, but it had not been gentle. It had shaped lives without announcing itself, leaving marks that were invisible to those who did not know how to look. And when the photograph eventually resurfaced, when careful eyes began to study what had once been taken for granted, it became clear that the house had never been as orderly as it claimed. Beneath the polished surfaces and measured tones, there had been fear, imbalance, and a silence mistaken for peace. The question that remained was not whether something had happened, but how many people had known and chosen to say nothing, and how long the truth could stay buried before the walls themselves began to whisper it back. The photograph surfaced quietly, without ceremony, as many truths do. It arrived inside a cracked leather ledger donated to a small regional archive, its spine broken, its pages warped by damp and time. The ledger had once belonged to the magistrate's estate, part of a larger collection meant to document property lines, tax payments, orderly things that fit neatly into rows. Tucked between those pages, pressed flat by years of neglect, was the photograph. No label, no explanation, just an image waiting to be seen again. At first glance, it looked unremarkable. Two young relatives, dressed well, seated properly, framed by a heavy curtain. The kind of photograph that filled albums and lined mantels across the turn of the century. Respectable, balanced, complete. The archivist nearly passed over it, moving on to more obviously valuable materials, but something slowed her hand. A feeling she could not name. She held the image longer than necessary, letting her eyes adjust, letting the paper speak in its own quiet way. It was not the faces that troubled her. It was the space around them. The way the light seemed reluctant. The way the shadows gathered too deliberately near the curtain's edge. She set the photograph aside, marked it for review, and returned to it days later with a historian who specialized in early photographic processes. Together, they studied the image under better light. Magnification revealed what the naked eye had only sensed. Near the edge of the velvet curtain there was a distortion, not a flaw in the paper, not a chemical blemish, a shape. Soft at first, almost apologetic, as though it did not wish to be noticed. As the image was restored and clarified, the shape sharpened into something unmistakably human. The outline of a third figure, not centered, not acknowledged. A young woman, her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly at her waist. She was not standing fully in frame, but she was there. Present enough to disturb the balance of the image. Present enough to ask a question that could no longer be ignored. The room fell quiet as the realization settled. Early photography did not invent figures that were not present. It recorded what stood before the lens, whether intended or not. The shadow was not a trick of light. It was a person. Someone who had been there that day, deliberately placed just beyond recognition. The photograph had captured not only who was meant to be seen, but who was meant to be hidden. Once noticed, the figure could not be unseen. The image rearranged itself in the mind, shifting from a portrait of family to a record of exclusion. The archivist began to search for context. Names, dates, anything that could explain the presence. Estate records confirmed the identities of the seated cousins. Church registries provided birth dates. Census documents showed household arrangements. And then a letter surfaced, folded carefully, never sent, written in a neat, restrained hand. It was dated just weeks after the photograph had been taken. The ink had faded, but the words remained clear. The letter did not accuse. It did not name names. It spoke instead of fear without a source, of obligations that felt heavier each day, of gratitude demanded in place of safety. It described a home that no longer felt like one, a space that closed in after dark. The writer wrote of trying to be good, of trying not to cause trouble, of not knowing how to leave when leaving was not an option. The tone was careful, almost apologetic, as though even in private confession the writer feared saying too much. The signature at the bottom matched the younger cousin's name. The archivist read the letter slowly, aware that she was holding something never meant for public eyes. It had not been sent. It had not been answered. It had been kept, folded away like the photograph itself. The letter did not stand alone for long. Another document surfaced soon after, a church burial entry from the following year. The handwriting was firm, official. The name matched the younger cousins. The age was noted precisely. The cause of death was vague, recorded in a way that suggested finality without explanation. There were no further details, no sermon transcript, no mention in local papers, just a line in a book closing a life with the same restraint that had defined it. The timing unsettled those who read it. The photograph, the letter, the burial, each on its own might have been dismissed as coincidence. Together they formed a pattern that resisted erasure. The historian traced the elder cousin's life next, following his name through public records. He had gone on to hold office, stepping into roles that echoed his father's authority. His reputation remained intact throughout his life. He was described as dependable, principled, steady. There were no scandals attached to his name, no charges filed, no rumors that reached print. Whatever had happened within the house had stayed there, sealed by silence and protected by status. The absence of accusation was once again mistaken for proof of innocence. But absence does not mean emptiness. It often means control. The photograph, once understood, reframed everything around it. What had been a family portrait became a quiet testimony. The third figure's bowed head suggested not shame, but resignation. The clasped hands spoke of restraint, of containment. She was present but positioned so that history would almost forget her. Almost. The image had waited decades for someone to look closely enough, patiently holding its secret until the world was ready to listen. As the findings were compiled, there was no dramatic announcement, no public reckoning. The truth emerged slowly through footnotes, through careful language, through exhibits that asked visitors to draw their own conclusions. The archivist resisted sensationalism. This was not a story of sudden revelation. It was a story of long suppression. The photograph was displayed alongside the letter and the burial entry, each given equal weight. Together, they spoke more clearly than any accusation could have. Visitors lingered before the image, their eyes drawn not to the seated figures but to the shadow at the edge. Some leaned closer, some stepped back. Many said nothing at all. Silence, once again, filled the space. But this silence was different. It was listening rather than concealing. The photograph had become a witness. It no longer served the family's narrative. It served history's. The shadow was no longer hidden. It stood, finally acknowledged, asking not for punishment but for recognition. The realization unsettled those who preferred clean stories, clear endings. There was no trial to revisit, no verdict to overturn. The elder cousin was long dead. The magistrate's name remained etched into civic records. The injustice could not be undone, but meaning could be changed. Memory could be corrected. The photograph, patient and unblinking, had done its work. It had outlived the silence meant to protect power. It had waited through decades of neglect, through careless handling, through being pressed between pages meant for numbers and property. And when it was finally seen for what it was, it rearranged the past without raising its voice. History had finally listened, not because someone shouted, but because the evidence refused to stay quiet any longer. The room captured in the image no longer felt orderly. It felt heavy. The space between the figures felt charged. The shadow felt close. What had once been a symbol of respectability became a reminder of how easily truth can be pushed to the margins. The photograph had never changed. It was the eyes looking at it that had learned to see. And as viewers turned away, carrying the image with them, one question lingered in the air, unanswered but unavoidable. How many other shadows were still waiting, pressed into paper and wood and stone, patient enough to outlast the silence that tried to erase them? The photograph now rests behind glass, carefully mounted, its paper supported so it will not bend again under the weight of time. The description beside it has been rewritten, not dramatically, not emotionally, but precisely, each word chosen with care. Visitors approach it expecting something ordinary and find themselves standing longer than they intended. Some lean in close, some step back, many say nothing at all. They feel watched, but not by the faces in the image. They feel watched by the space between them, by what is no longer hidden yet not fully explained. The glass reflects their own faces faintly, placing the present beside the past, reminding them that history does not stay where it is put. The house where the photograph was taken no longer exists. Its wood was dismantled piece by piece, reused in barns and sheds, scattered into new purposes. Its land was sold, divided, renamed. The house's name faded from maps, then from memory. But memory does not require walls to stand. It survives in fragments, in objects carried forward, in questions that refuse to settle. The magistrate's legacy has shifted quietly over time. His name still appears in records, but now it is followed by footnotes. Small marks that change how the page is read. His career is no longer held up as uncomplicated virtue. It is studied with context, with caution, with an understanding that order can exist alongside harm. The elder cousin's accomplishments remain listed, but they are no longer read without pause. His rise is no longer seen as inevitable or admirable by default. It is examined alongside the silence that protected him. The younger cousin's name, once barely mentioned, has been restored to the record. It appears now not as an afterthought, not as a dependent, not as a shadow, but as a witness. Her truth did not survive because she was loud or powerful. It survived because objects remembered what people chose to forget. There is no dramatic justice waiting at the end of this story, no courtroom reversal, no confession delivered too late, no apology carved into stone. The past remains what it was, the harm remains done. But meaning has changed and meaning matters. The photograph remains still as it always was. It does not accuse, it does not plead. It simply exists, holding its position, refusing to return to silence. It tells a story without words, a story of power mistaken for entitlement, of silence mistaken for consent, of respectability used as a shield. Visitors who stand before it feel the weight of that realization settle slowly. Not anger, not outrage, responsibility, because to see the truth is to inherit it. The room feels heavier after they turn away, not with blame, but with awareness. The kind that lingers, the kind that changes how other stories are read. Some names, long buried beneath politeness and shadow, only find peace when the truth is finally told.